Hello. All right. So today,
Hello.
hi. Today we're doing Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. All right. And I have 5 questions on test 3 that pertain to this subject. And then you have about 4 argumentative sections to choose from for your weekly assignment. Please note also, I'll give you a reminder via a Canvas message or announcement, but your first 3 quizzes are due on the 7th. So recall that, okay, as we're going through this week. And let's go ahead and get started if you don't mind. So let's see here. The New Deal, right? Under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, starting in after his election in 1932 and his inauguration in March of 33. He comes in and he generically states that he is going to bring about a new deal for the country. All right. And with that new deal, one thing, according to H.W. Brands, it was very evident that, according to H.W. Brands, that he was not a believer in laissez-faire capitalism. He did not believe that in the efficacy of the invisible hand of the market to do its magic. He literally used that term, that there's no silent, invisible magician that's going to get us out of the Great Depression, but purposeful planning on behalf of the government and intervention in the economy will be necessary for the country to extricate itself from the Great Depression. He also is going to literally liken the situation to a state of war. And he is going to ask Congress for a lot of power in his executive department by way of new agencies that he comes out, oftentimes named by acronyms, new agencies to combat the problems that he foresaw. One problem that is going to be very prevalent from 1932 to 1936 is overproduction and underconsumption. The country in almost every industry was producing much, much more than there was demand for. And remember, demand is not desire necessarily, right? It's the means. It's the economic means by which you can buy, you could purchase what's being produced. Americans couldn't purchase it, right? A quarter of the population, at some points the number gets as high as up into the 30s of the population was unemployed. Luchtenberg's book on the Great Depression and the New Deal gives a real sobering description of the misery found during the Great Depression. And we were in dire straits as far as unemployment, as far as demand, as ability to consume go. It was pretty scary. So at any rate, in his first 100 days, he orders Congress to meet by emergency session, likens them to a state of war, a war against poverty, long before Lyndon B. Johnson used that term, and stated that they were pretty much in a state of war, an emergency, and they needed to address the following issues. So he was going to follow his distant cousin Teddy Roosevelt's precedent with that bully pulpit type of MO that he followed, his modus operandi, whereby he would tell Congress, you were going to deal with this, you're going to deal with that, you're going to deal with this, you're going to deal with that, or else I'm going to go over your head and I'm going to go directly to the people. And he had a pretty effective means by doing that. In addition to the press and his press conferences, he had his famous fireside chats by way of the radio. And so he utilized those rather effectively, according to people from all sides of the political spectrum. So at any rate, he tells them, right, the first thing that needs to be done is they need to shut down the banks. There needs to be an increase in credibility and solubility of the banks. So he declares a bank holiday. Over 20 states had already done this, okay? So it wasn't his original idea. But he did it to all those banks that were connected to the Federal Reserve and the 12 regional banks. So he did that from March 6th to March 11th for about 5 days. And he kind of was a bit Darwinian in allowing those who were that didn't show a lot of promise to be upheld in the future. He let them die out, and to those that he deemed to be very integral and having a lot of loans out to a lot of people in multiple regions, etc., he bailed them out. And what he's going to do is he's going to engage in deficit spending. He's going to engage in printing fiat money that is no longer based on the gold standard, on how much gold the government held. And so that was very fiscally irresponsible, according to the Republicans, to just spend into debt. But he contended that such was the state of emergency, that such drastic measures were required. So at any rate, he shuts down the bank, and he gives a famous fireside chat and telling Americans, right, that unlike what you had believed as children, when you put your money into a bank, they don't put it into a vault and hold it there for you to come and extract, right? That they lend it out to multiple other parties that are in much need of it. And so therefore it is, you are doing your patriotic duty in keeping your money in the bank. And he appealed to their self-interest and said that we're working on something to guarantee your deposit. And I don't have that on here, but it's the FDIC, right? The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So the FDIC is going to guarantee up to $2,500. That doesn't sound like very much. It's a lot higher now. But at that time, that was much higher. With deflation. So at any rate, he said that, you know, it appealed to their self-interest also, that your money will be safe in the future when it has the sticker of the federal government on your local bank, that it's being subsidized by the Federal Reserve. And like I said, they were printing fiat money to help bail them out, and contended that it will accrue interest in the bank, unlike under your mattress. So he tells Americans, I guarantee you your money is safer in the bank than under your mattress. And within a month, I mean, this is incredible, throughout the nation, $1 billion was put, $1 billion more dollars. And they're in the Depression. They're in the depths of it in 32 and 33, was placed into the banks, was deposited into the banks. Such was the degree to which he encouraged confidence on behalf of the American people in the financial institutions, back into the banks, giving his promise with the seal of the eagle that it would be safe and accrue interest. Then he engaged in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. He had Congress do such. And with the, remember, all this is granted to executive departments. So Congress is giving these powers to carry this out to the executive, right? And with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, what they tried to do is realign agricultural production with demand and consumption. And so far too much wheat, far too much corn, far too much milk was being produced in light of the demand of the capacity of the American people to purchase it. So he had them literally destroy this stuff, which was controversial and pretty, risky. But again, he said that they were in a state of emergency and they needed to return to an equitable balance between supply and demand. And also, right, he, quote, encouraged people and subsidized them to switch crops when there was much, too high of a production of wheat and corn, etc. He would pay farmers to change to peach production or grape production or whatever it might be. So at any rate, the government now is coordinating with the leaders of the industries. Notice the leaders. So the small, California Valley growers in Patterson, California, they're probably not at the table with the Agricultural Adjustment Administration and the Farming Bureau. And so they're not getting much of a say in this, but they were given pretty much what the Supreme Court contended were dictates, told to cut down their acreage to so much, told to switch their farming produce to another product, etc. But of course, they would be paid to do such. They would be subsidized in doing it. So most people went along with it. But some people fought it, right, and said that this is tyrannical, telling me what to farm and how much of it to farm. It goes against our American political tradition and our capitalist economy, etc. So the Supreme Court is going to shoot it down, and they're going to rename it, and it's going to come back in the guise of another form under Soil Conservation Act. And they had good lawyers and were able to change the nomenclature and everything of the law to make it appear to be about consoiling or conserving soil. So at any rate, he's going to have his hands full with the Supreme Court. They're going to strike down, as you'll see, more than this. So then he institutes the Civilian Conservation Corps. He enlists 250,000 young men and puts them in military uniforms, puts them in military barracks, and sends them to state and national parks to do forestry work, and pays for them to have 3 meals a day, and get this, at one point mandated that they could only receive 1/3 of their salary because they were having everything paid for them, right? And 2/3 of their salary at one point had to go back to their families to give their families purchasing power, right? To be able to spend money. And the fact that they were in military regalia, this just looked a lot like Mussolini's black shirts over in Italy, in fascist Italy, and even the brown shirts of Nazi Germany. So critics, right, were very alarmed by the Civilian Conservation Corps, the government directly, in peacetime, having these military units of young men and having them engage in public works. Then you have the beginnings of the Glass-Steagall Act, and the Glass-Steagall Act basically called for federal supervision over the stock market. At first, it was put under the Federal Trade Commission, and then they established the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the SEC to this day is like the policeman, is known as the policeman of the stock market. And so you have to be apprised of what your stockbroker is up to with your investments. And they have to give honest accounts of the way in which they're gambling with your money. And this was very popular because there was a lot of anti-stock market sentiment, right, during the Great Depression. The fall of the stock market in October of 29 did not cause the Great Depression, but it greatly sped it up and exacerbated it. And so you have that going on. So notice a lot of these causes he's doing are very popular with the people. Then he begins the Tennessee Valley Authority within the first 100 days. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was a federal project of federal production of hydroelectric power and providing it subsidy-wise to the poor people of the South. So what they would find out what you could, like with, what is it, Article 8 housing, Section 8 housing, they'd find what they thought you could afford to pay for your electric power, your electricity, and the federal government would foot the rest of the bill. And so this is flirting with gas and water socialism, right? Where you just determine that certain things like access to electricity and water, et cetera, ought to be separated from the capitalist system as far as being based upon merit of what you could afford to buy or not afford to buy, and that it's afforded as a natural right for people to have access to it. And so the Tennessee Valley Authority was seen to be, flirting with gas and water socialism and was very controversial, but it was brought about in the first 100-day session of Congress. And then they initiated the National Industrial Recovery Act. And this was in complete violation of the antitrust laws. Is they wrote over 700 codes for any industries that were connected to interstate commerce. That was their clause that they tried to get through with this, is stating that if your business goes across state lines, then technically, right, traditionally, according to the courts and according to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Congress and the federal government have authority over regulation of interstate commerce, interstate trade. So at any rate, if your business went across state lines, they would mandate codes, and the codes mandated how to treat your workers, included the Wagner Act, which would be added to it, WAGNER. And the Wagner Act applied the first, as long as you were, again, related to interstate business, the first national minimum wage law. So it included a minimum wage for your workers. It included maximum hours that that you could work them. It included the manner by which you produced your stuff. So this is along the progressives, right? Franklin Roosevelt is going to call himself a progressive. In 1936, he even flirted with like his distant cousin, forming a third progressive party. Okay, so he very much identified as a progressive, and so they had cases in which they were mandating how to kill animals, how to and if you had sick animals, you could not kill them and have and feed them to the consuming public, etc. So very progressive flavor to this. So they mandated certain elements to how things were produced. Also prices. They started having price codes and putting up price ceilings that you cannot charge more than this for your product. And what they did it is under the guise of cooperation, that everyone within the entire industry should no longer be cutthroat, but they should cooperate and play fairly in how they treat their workers and how they produce their product and in how much they charge for their product. But remember, that type of government coordination and government institution of codes and price levels, the fascist countries like Germany and the communist Russian country were doing this, right? So this was scary to conservatives. And so it was shut down. It went over a chicken case, the Schechten case, of how chickens were slaughtered. And they contended that they had no authority to mandate that. And it was shut down. And he had other ways to try to get around this Supreme Court denial, as he did in other instances. But look how many things are being shot down by the Supreme Court. This is some controversial stuff.
Hey, Derek, I have a question.
Yeah.
So is that kind of like politics considered like Marxist?
That's exactly what the Republican Party stated, is that this was Marxist. You look at his unofficial cabinet, and a lot of them were members of the USS Roosevelt expedition, named after Teddy Roosevelt. They went to Europe during the Great Depression, and they were Columbia University, Harvard, and Yale, progressive intellectual professors, etc., right? And they went throughout communist Russia and other areas of Europe, and they noted down good ideas, what they perceived to be effective ideas and policies made by these governments. And people were aghast at their conclusions, right? Like, wow, you're praising communist Russia, the Soviet Union, for their collectivization of agriculture program. It was scary to a lot of people. And so Franklin Roosevelt knew that it would not be palatable to the Senate for their approval, nor even to the public opinion, to put these radicals from that expedition on his official cabinet, but he put them as unofficial members. So you have a guy named Adolf Burl, you have a guy named Rex Tugwell, and many others. Well, not many, but a handful of them. And he put them as assistants to his Secretary of the Interior, his Secretary of the Treasury, his leader of the Department of Agriculture, etc., right? And what he would do is he would make them hash out their ideas with his actual conservative frontmen and cabinet members. He would tell them, and I guess they would just, they were completely on opposite end of the spectrum, right? And he would say, I want you to come up with an idea of how to deal with the farming problems that we're facing today. And, you have a guy named Morgenthau, another guy named Wallace, and they're pretty centralist, if anything, a little bit to the right. And then but he puts them in a room with someone like Rex Tugwell, who was praising the Soviet Union, right? And he says, and he would just laugh and say, you guys need to come to some type of consensus and then come and speak to me. And so he had this kind of MO that he followed of secretly putting these kind of far to the left intellectuals in cooperation with his actual front men, his actual cabinet choices, who are oftentimes as Republican as they were Democrat. He was a Democrat, trying to look bipartisan, right? And make them come to terms. Then usually when they would come up with an idea, he would throw in his questions and his own opinion on the matter and see what both of them had to say about it on both ends of the spectrum. Then he would have a Monday and Friday press conference every week. And he would meet with the press conference, and they said he was known to ask the members of the press as many questions as they had of him, and ask them, what do you think if we flirted with this idea? What do you think the public would think? What do you think the public would think if we flirted with that idea, etc.? And if something seemed very radical to the public and to the press, he would back off and he would bide his time on such an idea. So the question, arises, was he really a secret radical who was trying to see how much he could get away with and what could become palatable to his generation of people? And to what extent was he a typical politician who wanted people on both ends of the spectrum, and he just pragmatically wanted to do whatever could get us out of the Great Depression, and he didn't care if it was left or right? And I think it's an intriguing question to this very day. So I don't know if I answered your question at all, Kevin, but all right. So then he has the Works Progress Administration. At any given time, he employed 2.5 million Americans directly for public works, and not just building bridges and roads and buildings, etc., right? As is commonplace with the history of public works. But also he had a federal writers project, a federal theaters project, a federal poetry project. I mean, he hired people for an array of reasons to do an array of things, just to give them a job, right? And this is where John Maynard Keynes comes in, Keynes. And John Maynard Keynes said, the litmus test for a healthy economy is to make sure that those at the bottom of the pyramid have purchasing power. As long as the average working class people have money in their pockets for disposable income and go to the market and spend that money, you will have a healthy economy. And it just so happened that a lot of Franklin Roosevelt's, his intrigues, his policies, etc., seem to be in line with John Maynard Keynes' writings. And so they call it Keynesian or Keynesian economics. And that's what Franklin Roosevelt seemed to do. And another way of demonstrating him to be a bit revolutionary, a bit visionary, right? And novel.
I was just gonna, oh, sorry, Derek.
No, go ahead.
Interrupt you.
It's okay.
I was just gonna say that kind of sounds like what was happening within politics currently with all this stimulus money, how they were mentioning if giving it back to the lower community, lower class people was gonna improve the economy and stuff like that.
That absolutely is Keynesian. Yes, absolutely. And so that's something to consider today. A lot of people in academia to this day praise Franklin Roosevelt. Court history of Franklin Roosevelt is strong. It's been pretty pervasive in academia. And so that is a slant, that is a bias that we should be mindful of. But yeah, it's up to you to determine what merit that it has, that court narration of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. But it is what it is. And so oftentimes Franklin Roosevelt to this day is praised for his Keynesian economics and his philosophical approach to ensure first and foremost that the people at the bottom have purchasing power. Now, a difference that I would say, one difference from the generation is the dole, right? DOLE, giving stimulus checks, right? Franklin Roosevelt didn't have the stomach for that, according to multiple sources. He couldn't go that far. I don't know how much of that is personally and how much he knew that his generation wouldn't put up with that and his opposition wouldn't put up with that. Is he insisted, right, that the people work for that government money. So notice his was in the form mainly of work relief, of giving people directly jobs rather than just giving them checks. Because if you look even at Social Security, he arguably was a little bit slow, and it took him a good year or two before he would entertain that notion of Social Security. And that's even with people paying into it, right? With age-old pensions. And so, but absolutely, the fact that his approach was in line with that of John Maynard Keynes, and that modern administration right now is in line with John Maynard Keynes, I think absolutely that parallel is real and very evident. And hence why he's often praised in the history books. So at any rate, yeah, with the Works Progress Administration, what a vast public works program, right? 2.5 million at any given time, directly employed by the federal government. Because oftentimes with public works in the past, right, clear up through Hoover, is they would use a private middleman. They would use private construction companies to hire their own workers and to determine the salaries of their workers and the terms of their workers, et cetera. Now it's directly the federal government. And the very fact of symbolically that people put on uniforms, virtually every facet of the WPA and the Works Progress Administration involved some type of uniform and regularity of schedule, et cetera, and salary. It's to the conservatives and the traditionalists, it smacked of what was going on in Europe with the fascist countries and with the Soviet Union. So, he raised a lot of eyebrows, to say the least, with this New Deal. And the Social Security Act, oftentimes there's kind of an exception here. While FDR oftentimes is praised as being kind of avant-garde and at the head of novelty, right, with a lot of these programs, with Social Security, he's not. We have evidence that he was very hesitant to do it. We also have evidence directly from his lips that he was taking the thunder from the further left. Look up a guy named Huey Long. Huey Long was a politician in Louisiana, and he had a platform known as Share Our Wealth program. And it was pretty radical, even according to Franklin Roosevelt. It was too far to the left. As far as heavily taxing the rich and having land redistribution programs, wealth redistribution checks to the poor, etc. And Huey Long and others like Townsend in California were further to the left than Franklin. And they advocated this, and he saw how popular it was as a cause. And in 36, his rhetoric was more radical than it had been in 32. And he said that by then he gave a famous speech to Congress where he said that for these safety net policies of his administration, that money had to come from somewhere. And it was high time that the wealthy pay their due, that none of them, and he quoted Andrew Carnegie, none of them had become wealthy without the silent partnership of all their workers, all their consumers, and the public at large. And so he pushed for high inheritance taxes from the wealthy, very progressive income taxes. So the higher income bracket you're in, the higher tax rate, not just the actual revenue is taken from you. And so he gave some very, some almost inciting class warfare, according to his opponents in his 36 campaign. When he ran for re-election, saying, right, kind of likening himself to a modern Robin Hood or Andrew Jackson, saying that he was the man of the people and he was against the entrenched, privileged interests of the few, the big Wall Street guys, the big bankers, the big corporations. and he was going to make them toe the line in what was good for the entire country. And so when he couldn't get the Supreme Court to cooperate with him, when he couldn't get Congress to cooperate with him, he engaged in some heavy rhetoric in his speeches and in his fireside chats to the common people to try to enlist their help to go above their heads. All right. Then the Fraser Lemke Act put a 5-year moratorium on foreclosures of farms. Said, okay, big bankers, you can't foreclose on these poor farmers for 5 more years. And you have to give them a second chance at a mortgage to reclaim their farms. And in some regions, the rate went as high as 40%. Nearly half of farmers were able to regain their farms through this act, but then it was shot down by the Supreme Court. And so, see, I mean, that says a lot as far as the novelty of his administration. How many of his policies were shot down by the Supreme Court. And so then in 36, like I said, he really vamped up his anti-rich rhetoric and tried a court-packing attempt by way of a famous speech to Congress, where he stated that, historically, the Supreme Court had begun with only 6. Then in this given year, it was moved up to 9. And the workload of the Supreme Court is especially burdensome at this time with his New Deal, and that quite a few of the 9 were up at retirement age. So if they refuse to retire, that they ought to add 4 members to the Supreme Court and pack it to 13. And of course, with the 13, he could appoint the 4, who would, of course, would have been in favor of his New Deal and his New Deal policies. It didn't fly. It didn't work, but he tried to do so. And his opponents accused him of being a demagogue, right? A manipulator of the people for his own empowerment. So what I want to do is I want to begin to share the notes on here. Well, here's the actual assignment. So we have here court history. President Franklin Roosevelt was praised as an idealistic revolutionary. All right. So like I said, this is those who are for Keynesian economics, modern liberals. They praise him to this day as a visionary, someone who knew that you have to give purchasing power to the common man. You have to have more government intervention in the economy, especially over, like with the National Industrial Recovery Act, over industries and over farmers. And so, yeah, you're going to find that with number 1, okay? So evidence of novelty, but in a good way, right? That novelty is praised as being bold and revolutionary. Then number 2 is more of a sentimental court history interpretation, right? It's saying that Franklin Roosevelt underwent a personal transformation that made him a more compassionate president during the time of the Great Depression. It's almost depicted as providential, like it was God's will that he contract polio and that he marry Eleanor Roosevelt, that it made a kind patriarch, benevolent patriarch of him that became a champion of the underdog, of what he said in 32 when he ran for president. He was for the forgotten man at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid. So look and see how he gained a sense of empathy when he was at Warm Springs, Georgia, with the kids who had contracted polio, and how he gained a sense of empathy for them. Look and see how Eleanor, despite the strangeness of their relationship, oftentimes they did not live together. He had affairs. She had close female friends that she spent most of her time most of her time with. And but she had a way of eliciting depth from him, according to multiple accounts. Eleanor, there were letters to her, whereby people would ask her for everything from a baby sister, an adopted baby sister, to a cow, etc. I mean, she was like the Oprah Winfrey of her time period, this kind matriarch. She did a great deal of help for Franklin in her publicity appearances, helping out the marginalized, helping out the United Coal workers, the mine workers, African Americans, women, you name it, a marginalized group. She symbolically reached out to that group and did a lot as far as publicity in gaining their trust, so to speak. Not to mention World War I veterans who had been dealt with harshly by Hoover and his men when they came demanding the early reception of their military stipends, known as the bonus army. They were dealt with militarily, and a few of them were even killed by Hoover. And Franklin Roosevelt commented someone that said, that just got me elected, just prior to their election against each other. And in contrast to that, that same bonus army kind of reappeared under the new administration of Roosevelt, and Franklin sent his wife to them, and she dined with them and just gave them a very warm reception. And so you see a much different picture with Franklin Roosevelt as this benevolent patriarch in the time when our country needed it most. And his fireside chats, however much they were genuinely empathetic, and however much they were, demagogic and manipulative, they were effective. He would start off with his fireside chats and say, how are you doing today? It breaks my heart if you were unable to feed your kids dinner. But I want you to know that this week I did this, this, and this. I went to Congress and demanded that they do that, that, and that. And I want to let you know that I am on the march, and it is my utmost priority to ensure that you could put food on your table. And so he was a great communicator, a very effective communicator, by way of the fireside chats, by way of his biweekly press conferences. He was something else as far as his charisma. Then number 3, President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was not a well thought out idealistic crusade. He was a typical political pragmatist, according to William Leuchtenberg in his book. So he says, I don't think this guy really knew where he stood. I don't think he was this clear cut to the left ideologue. I think that he trusted those guys on the USS Roosevelt. He deferred to their intelligence, and he deliberately paired them with people much further to the right, because he didn't share their leftist views per se, but he wanted to have everything from both sides of the spectrum represented in his administration and see what they could come up with, right, as a final result. That he was a pragmatist. He wanted to do whatever practically brought about the best result. But I will say with this thesis, however much merit there might be to it, that I find convincing what H.W. Brands stated in his book is, regardless of where he really did or did not stand, he made it clear by 32, long before 36. He made it clear by 32 that he was no laissez-faire believer, that he was going to intervene in the economy and do something. He has a quote that says, "For God's sakes, try something." And so, he could have been a little bit of all the above. There could be merit to all of these, whereby, because I try to find an ideologue earlier than president. And, he went against his distant cousin's party. Teddy was a Republican. And at a young age, he said, no, I'm going to be a Democrat. Then when the progressive movement went on, there is evidence that he wouldn't touch the most controversial subjects of the progressives. And he definitely didn't touch gas and water socialism and anything that was to the far left of the progressive movement when he was a young politician. So he didn't take a lot of really bold stands when he was at Harvard and had his own newspaper, etc. But when by the time he became governor of New York, he had something known as TERA. I don't remember what it stood for, but the acronym was TERA. And it was it provided public works and help for the less fortunate in New York to combat the Great Depression. So he flirted with stuff like this when he was governor of New York. It wasn't just something brand new that he kind of, tripped upon as president. So I don't know how far I would go along with Leuchtenberg. But still, it's something to think about what Leuchtenberg says, that this guy was a typical politician, wanting to do whatever was popular and whatever could help rectify, actual problems like unemployment and low demand for consumer and other products.
Derek, why was that seem like a negative thing that he wanted to know a little bit of everything?
That's a great question. It's just that, like I said, painting him as this vision, because he's saying that he wasn't a visionary, that he doesn't deserve credit for that, right? Because, let's face it, we have traditionally evolved a bit to the left, right? As far as both parties today, as far as our assumptions of the role of the federal government to get involved in the capitalist economy and not just let the invisible hand do its thing. And so he's saying that he doesn't deserve credit of being this visionary who saw it before all of us, that this needs to be done, right? Like John Maynard Keynes in his writings. But that this guy was, he didn't even really know what he stood for. He didn't really know where he stood. Because one thing that they state on both sides of the spectrum is they state that Franklin Roosevelt was a great listener, that he oftentimes had as many questions for other people as they had for him when he was a politician and before he was a politician.
Maybe that's why, if he didn't know, maybe that's why he wanted to know everybody's perspective so he could get his own.
Exactly. And I think that's a great question, Laura, is you could challenge Leuchtenberg and say, okay, maybe there's some truth to that, but even if there is, why is that a bad thing? He was open-minded, right? He wanted to hear from both sides. He wanted to see what would work. He dabbled with this and dabbled with that. And, because the fact that the federal government is directly intervening and saying, okay, you can't charge more than this. You have to pay your wages, minimum wages. That could be considered fascist or communist, right? The fascist countries on the far right were also doing that. And so, absolutely. That's what I'm inferring, Laura, from your question is to the extent that may have been true, why is that a bad thing? And I agree with that question.
Thank you.
All right. And another one that I didn't have on here that perhaps I should have done the full gamut of the historiography of FDR. I don't know about the full gamut, but the gamut that I've come across. So one is he's idealistically bold and he's ahead of the game, right? As a bold radical. Two, that he's just or secondly, that he's just a compassionate man, that he's become a compassionate despot a bit though, right? As far as his enrichment of the powers of the executive department. Thirdly, that he is just a pragmatist. He doesn't know where he stands. He doesn't have really a clear-cut political platform, and he's just running on his toes, trying to improvise, right? And then fourthly, what I've come across is that he's secretly conservative. Is that when you think about it, when all was said and done, he saved capitalism, right? He altered it greatly, but he saved capitalism. He didn't gravitate us to fascism. We didn't become communist, right? He saved the banks. He saved the stock market. He saved the big corporations, even though he highly regulated them. And so in a sense, in the end game, he was conservative. He conserved the system at a great era of trial during this horrific depression. And so that's another. And then also evident of that thesis is his opposition to those who were further to the left. Like I said, look up a guy named Huey Long. Look up a guy far to the right named Father Laughlin, Louglin. Father Laughlin and Huey Long were very far to the left and far to the right and far to the left, respectively. And he saw both of them as scary. He was frightened by both of them. So was he truly just a conservative, secretly, wanting to do everything he could to salvage the system and keep our capitalist economy afloat? Okay. And number 4, please see my little caveat before. I don't personally adhere to this thesis, but I think it's very thought-provoking. So why not put it up there for you to chew on? And that is, right, as Pearl Harbor attack was foreseen and nothing was done about it, that it was deliberately allowed to happen to provoke anti-Japanese sentiment, to get us to help England out when England was on its heels fighting World War II. So like I said, I personally, from what I've read, adhere more to the we got caught sleeping thesis, our arrogance and hubris and ineptitude. I personally, subjectively lean more to that thesis, but I find there's just enough in this thesis to really make you think. And so why not? So I threw it out there. All right, that we deliberately allowed it to happen, our government, to galvanize the country into pro-war sentiment against the fascist countries. Kind of as a segue into the next assignment on World War II. All right. So if you want to take a look at the questions, do you have any questions about the questions? Where we have it here. The first 5 questions of your final.
I have a question.
Sure.
So on number 2, could you explain the TVA and how were they coordinated with farming?
Yeah, the TVA did not. I deliberately mixed it up. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, right, engaged in federal subsidization and coordination of farming. The TVA flirted with gas and water socialism. Remember, in the South, the government produced hydroelectric power and then provided it subsidized fashion to the poor Southern people. So absolutely, that's the one that doesn't fit.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, as always. All right, anybody else? And I have these posted for you as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So if you guys don't have any other questions, I'm done. I hope I made it half as interesting as it objectively really is. What a fascinating topic, the New Deal. and Franklin Roosevelt. And by the way, you know, as far as plans to accusations of calling him a demagogue, the way that he would go to Congress and say, you're going to do this, this, and this, and if not, I'm going to go around you to the people, the way he tried to pack the Supreme Court to support his New Deal, the way that he got Congress not only to pass this legislation, but in order to carry it out, give power to all these executive department agencies, right? So it greatly enhanced the executive branch. But where else was I going with that? As far as the demagogue thesis. Oh, shoot. Now I blanked out of where I was heading. I'm sorry. But just be familiar with that accusation as well of him being claimed as a demagogue. Oh, he was elected 4 times. He ran for president and won 4 consecutive times. The only president to do such. And you could guess what his rationale for that was, right? Is that they were in a state of emergency and a virtual state of war against poverty, against the Depression. And then, of course, by 41, they were in an actual war in World War II. And it was no time to change pilots. All right, you guys. So thank you. I hope you learned something, and I hope I did decently on this subject and did it some decent credit, because it's a fascinating topic. All right.
Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate this class. I love giving you extra credit. I love meeting with you guys. It's the next best thing to meeting in class.
Thanks, Derek. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I was gonna tell you, Derek, that, this is not related to class or whatever, but I was gonna mention to you that I'm taking the humanities course as well, Humanities 101. And I mean, and it almost feels like I'm taking 2 history classes, honestly.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I know that you're a U.S. history teacher, but I don't know how much you're into like old history as well. But recently I've been super intrigued by like Roman history and Greek history.
Oh,
you know,
sure.
I know that that's more of old like history, but I've been obsessed with it lately, just kind of trying to learn more about every single person, you know, in the past. Is just, I've been wanting to get what's his name, I believe, what was the emperor, Commodus's father? Oh
gosh, it's been too long for me. I'm sorry, Kevin. I couldn't tell you.
So with that, I'm guessing you're not too into old history.
I am, and I try my best to read it on the side. And that's precisely the type of history that I am interested in, is classical Greece and Rome.
Yeah, I love it.
I have not taught that in 17 years of teaching. I've been given 2 semesters to be able to teach that in 17 years. And it was years and years ago. So yeah, gosh, I don't have the command over it that I wish I did, but I assure you my interest is there, back on my shelves, on the side here.
Augustus.
Okay, Augustus.
Yeah, he has his philosophy book, his personal diary.
Sure.
He has like a pretty much like a personal diary where he wrote his. It was intended only for himself, but was later found and translated into like philosophy or whatnot, because he was considered the most philosophical emperor of Rome.
I see.
But yeah, I've just been super fascinated, honestly. You know, I didn't get the opportunity to like pay attention during high school as much as I would have liked to, like world history and stuff like that.
Of course. I think we could all say that, Kevin. That's very common.
You know, I guess I didn't give it that much energy or interest, but now that I'm hearing it as an adult, I appreciate it so much more. And I realize it's just like, it's, for me, it's just been really like awesome, honestly. And just,
that's, you know, great.
But I just wanted to mention that. I don't want to take too much of your time away. It was good talking to you, Derek. I appreciate the Zoom meetings.
As do I. As do I. So thank you, Kevin. And but absolutely, you find relevance, an incredible degree of relevance in classical Greece and Rome to today. And you have me desirous of going over to my right and getting back to my Greco-Roman books whenever
it really just surprises me how intelligent these people were for those times.
Oh yeah.
You know, like and in so many ways, but yeah, man, their politics as well, you know, especially the Romans, how, you know, yeah, but maybe you should touch up on it, Derek.
I will do that. I will.
It was good talking to you, Derek.
You as well, Kevin.
Have a good one.
All right, you too, man. Bye-bye.